So what exactly is courage, and how do you know you're finding it in the midst of fear? I think that most people agree that courage is a good thing and they want it. And I think people generally feel that courage has a very important focus, but there's two sides that can be extreme. If you get too far to one side, that's cowardice, right? You're passive, you're not acting. But you can overdo it, right? And you can just kind of say, I'm courageous, and you just kind of go rushing in. You don't have all the facts, you don't have wisdom, you don't weigh all the options, and that's called recklessness. Well, welcome everybody to the Salty Pastor Podcast. I am your soft, sweet, and oh so tender salty pastor, Dr. Douglas Peak, here to coach you up in your faith and help you get the tools to think for yourself. That's really a critical thing here. Is we believe that the best thing for you is to know what you believe and why you believe it. So I'm not here to tell you, what music you should listen to, what clothes you should wear, what your political views ought to be. What I'd really like to do is help you determine all of those things for yourself. Because in the end, what you need to do is you need to be able to not only defend to yourself, but to those around you what you believe and why you believe it. But it's also critical for the process of developing maturity in your life. And that's where wisdom comes from. So the Salty Pastor Podcast is all about coaching you up in your faith. And so we go on a journey. Every Tuesday, we will dive into the Bible on whatever particular topic that we're on. We're going to glean the principles from there. And then on Thursday, we apply those things to our everyday life. So we're glad that you're joining us. And today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about courage. Last week we talked about confidence, and today we're going to talk about courage. And the whole point of courage is that it happens usually right in the middle of fear. And so I want to talk first and foremost, give you a little bit about context about courage, where it comes from, and why it's so important in your life. And the first thing is this, is that our brains are actually wired to fear. And that's why it's usually in the midst of our fears. And fears always come from adversities, right? You have a problem or a threat or a conflict or something that really rocks your world. That's called an adversity, right? You have adversity in your life. And then that creates fear. And so it's in that moment in your life where you can discover courage. And so one of the things I'd like to do is just ask you real quick, what are some of your greatest fears? And I don't mean spiders or, snakes or those types of things, but deep down, what do you think in your own heart are some of your deepest fears? Is it not being loved? Is it wondering if you'll ever be man enough? If you can ever make it or be successful? Is it being abandoned? We have all kinds of fears. What's interesting is whenever we get into adversity, then that's when our deepest fears tend to come out. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to show you a situation where the disciples were fearful, and then how Peter himself had to face his fear. And so this story in the New Testament has always been associated with fear and finding courage in the midst of your fear. So let's read it. It starts in Matthew chapter 14, and it begins with verse 22. So this is immediately after there was a time when he was teaching, and he fed all of the multitudes, right? If you look back up in 18, he says it was the 5 loaves and 2 fish situation, and they fed all the things. And then immediately after, it says, he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side. Now, this is the Sea of Galilee, which is actually a big lake. He says, while he sent the multitudes away. And after he had sent the multitudes away, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. And it was the evening. He was there all alone. But the boat was already many, the word here is stadia that they use, meaning kind of leagues or it's a distance from the shore, right? And it started to be battered by waves, for the wind was contrary. In other words, the wind was buffeting him, blasting him, all that kind of stuff. And verse 25, shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. So you got to have to understand is that it was the night before, and they're trying to row across the lake, and they get stuck out on the lake. It is a big lake, but they get stuck out there, and they're getting tossed here and there by the wind. They're not making any progress because they were supposed to go to the other side. But Jesus, it says, just before dawn, starts walking on the water, and the disciples see him walking on the lake, and they're terrified. They go, oh my goodness, it's a ghost, it's an apparition, they said. And they cry out in fear. And that's really important there, is that they cry out in fear. They're very, very afraid. But Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. Now Peter then replies, Lord, if it is you, let me come to you on the water. And Jesus says, come. So Peter got down out of the boat, walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. Verse 30. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and he began to sink. And he cried out, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? And I thought that was really interesting. Why do you doubt? And when they got into the boat, the wind suddenly stopped. And those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, you certainly are God's son. And when they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized him, they sent into all the surrounding district and brought to him all who were ill. And they began to entreat him that they might just touch the fringe of his cloak. As many as touched it could be cured. So this story is such a wonderful story, I think, because there's so many things to glean from it. But before we do that, I want to give you a little, kind of go back to some other passages of scriptures to give us a little context on courage. Remember, in John chapter 16, verse 33, Jesus says to the disciples, I have told you these things, meaning he's told them about who he is and what he came to do, so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Here's the bottom line, friend. You're not going to live very long until your life has trouble, until you have adversity, until things go wrong, until you're misunderstood, and people think things and say things about you that aren't true. And it's going to be difficult. Things aren't going to go your way. You're going to have really big problems. And that's called adversity. And Jesus said, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. And I think it's really important, and this is a lesson I've been learning over and over again, is that in the midst of adversity, it's really difficult to find peace in your capacity to solve the problem. It's really difficult to find peace in your ability to figure out the right strategy or all the angles. It's really difficult to find peace in adversity when you keep asking the question, why is this happening to me? And there doesn't seem to be any good answer as to why. So the point is that in the midst of adversity, we always want peace. But the only place that you can find peace in the midst of adversity, Jesus says, is in him. And I think that's really important, is that it has to be in him. He says, you're going to have trouble in this world, but take heart, I have overcome the world. So it's in him where we find the capacity to overcome our adversity. And the reason I bring that out is because I think that is the key to discovering courage in the midst of fear. Joshua chapter 1, verse 9 says this, have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Now, he said, the Lord is commanding the Israelites, be strong, be courageous, and don't be afraid. And then he gives them the reason why. He says, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. And then Paul writes to the Corinthians in his first letter to them, chapter 16, verse 13, he says, be on your guard, stand firm in the faith, be courageous, be strong. And then Philippians 1:20 says, I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now as always Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me to live is Christ, but to die is gain. What a powerful statement that Paul makes. If I'm going to live, it's all for Jesus. And if I die, I win as well. It is a gain. So he goes, I want to stand firm in the faith and be courageous and strong. So what exactly is courage? And how do you know you're finding it in the midst of fear? Well, mental or moral strength, this is the definition of courage. It's mental or moral strength to venture, persevere, and withstand any danger, fear, or difficulty. So that's what courage is. It's that ability to have strength, whether mentally in your brain or morally, to persevere and withstand danger or threat as it comes against you. And remember, we started off by saying your brain is wired to fear. It's wired to assess threats and then react to them. The ancient Greeks focused on this idea of courage a lot. Aristotle wrote about it in his Nicomachean Ethics. Plato, he wrote about them in his writings called the Laches. He shows a discussion between Socrates and two other men, all on courage. Cicero wrote that courage was one of the main virtues of Rome. Thomas Aquinas wrote that courage, and his word for courage was fortitude, but he wrote that fortitude was the third most important virtue for followers of Christ behind prudence and justice. So I think that most people agree that courage is a good thing and they want it. And I think people generally feel that courage, kind of has a very important focus, but there's two sides that can be extreme, right? So there's basically three categories. If you get too far to one side, that's cowardice, right? You're passive. You're not acting. But you can overdo it, right? And you can just kind of say, I'm courageous, and you just kind of go rushing in. You don't have all the facts. You don't have wisdom. You don't weigh all the options, and that's called recklessness. And so courage is not cowardice and passivity. Courage is not recklessness. Courage is a moral and mental strength to persevere and withstand danger, any type of adversity, in the midst of the fear those things produce in your life. Daniel Putman, professor at the University of Wisconsin, wrote a book titled Emotions of Courage. Well, that sounds interesting. He states that courage is facing your fear in an appropriate manner. You see, fear and courage are deeply intertwined, and that they rely on distinct perceptions. So as we really dig into it, I think that's critical. First of all, fear and courage are intertwined because you see there's danger in this situation. Then the second thing that you have to kind of navigate is this notion that what is the worthiness of my cause? Because sometimes what you do is you say, well, that doesn't have anything to do with me. I'm just going to walk away, right? But the other side of it is you can overdo it and rush into situations that don't involve you and get, all riled up about stuff. That's not courage at all. That's recklessness. But the third thing he talks about is it requires a perception of your own ability. Like, what, if anything, could I even do about this, right? You ask that whether you're in cowardice phase, you ask that whether you're in recklessness phase, and you ask that whether you're in courage phase. So let's just recap that real quick. He says you have to have three perceptions to work through. Number one, how dangerous is this situation? Number two, how worthy is the cause for me to engage in it? And number three, what is my perception of my own ability to navigate this properly? So, I kind of believe that this plays out in different ways. Number one, if you have an unrealistic assessment of the danger of the situation, then you fall into cowardice or recklessness, right? If you have an unrealistic assessment of the danger of the situation, You fall into cowardice, meaning I'm not going to do anything, I'm just going to avoid it, or recklessness, and that is you rush in and you start making demands and basically causing more conflict. And so that's because there's an unrealistic assessment of the situation. Number two, if you devote your life to an unworthy cause, you can fall into passivity or cowardice or even apathy. You just don't care about anything. Or you can fall into recklessness and bigotry. So you got to make sure that if you want to be a courageous person, your life is devoted to a worthy and righteous cause. The other thing that I think is really interesting is he says the perception of one's own ability. And that is this: if you think too lowly of yourself, or if you think too highly of yourself, you can fall into either cowardice or recklessness. And so I think that's really a significant point to consider. So now that we have this context, let's go back to what Jesus said when he says, take courage, right? And ask ourselves this question. Okay, Jesus, what are you actually asking us to do? And I think this is where we can really think through what we believe, why we believe it, and gain wisdom on how to deal with things. Number one, I think Jesus is telling us, if we're going to be courageous, to get an accurate read on the situation. This is called wisdom. What is the first thing he tells the disciples in this story? He says, look, it's me. It's not a ghost. So the first thing he does is he goes, I'm real. I'm here. You're not seeing a hallucination. Discovering courage is about seeing the situation through the perspective, I believe, of Jesus Christ. Whenever you're in a situation where you think you have to act, and you think you have to act courageously, it's important to evaluate the situation by asking yourself a very important question. And I think that question is this: hey, God, this is what I see. Would you please tell me what you see? And I think that's important, because oftentimes what we do is when there's like conflict in situations, what we do is we constantly impugn motive and we run what we see through our own filter. And our filters are usually developed from our past. And so what we're doing is we're allowing our past to affect our judgment in the current situation. And that's not always accurate. And that's really important. So if you want to be a courageous person, I think you have to ask God, tell us, Lord, what you see in this situation. Now, on the one hand, you may feel like what you're facing is the worst thing that's ever happened to any human being since the beginning of time, right? But it is the most unfair, unjust, abusive thing you could imagine. You wouldn't wish it on your worst enemy. Or you can see what's happening in your life and just dismiss it. You say, well, I don't care. It doesn't affect me. Walk away and just kind of, forget about it. Both of these extremes can cause cowardice or recklessness. So you have to ask yourself the simple question: how does Jesus view the situation? Number two, Jesus is telling us we need to clarify our priorities by committing ourselves to the most worthy cause of all. Paul says that faith in Jesus Christ is worthy of your life because it's causing a transformational change in every human heart. That's why he says, for to me to live is Christ, but to die is gain. He says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God unto salvation. So when you find a super high calling, then it's so much more easier to be courageous. And I think that is significant, okay? Jesus is building his kingdom. It is the worthiest cause you will ever devote your life to. And he's building his kingdom on redemption, reconciliation, and love. And these are some of the greatest action steps that you can ever take. And that, I think, is what requires courage. And oftentimes what we think is courageous activity or action isn't very courageous at all. It's just reckless, and it causes more hurt. And so I think Jesus is telling us we need to clarify our priorities by committing ourselves to a higher cause. And the higher the cause, then the more pure our priorities are. They'll never be perfect, But then what it does is allows us to know how to act courageously and not cowardly or recklessly. The third thing is this. Jesus is telling us to assess our own skill level. This is the concept that Paul tells the Corinthians before they take communion, break bread together, is that you need to examine yourself. And I think it's good to have a brutally honest conversation with yourself, particularly when it comes to your skill level. And I feel like it's easy for people. Well, no, that's the wrong way. I'd say it's simple, but not easy. For instance, you can hike up to base camp at Mount Everest, and someone goes, well, what do you do now? And you go, it's simple, climb to the top. That certainly is not an easy endeavor. It's simply stated, but very, very difficult to do. I feel that we need to understand that when we come to faith in Jesus Christ, we have to recognize that we are incomplete. Our soul is tainted and it needs to be renewed. So when we turn to Jesus Christ, he saves you, he redeems you, right? And then we're renewed. And that's why I think courage happens greatest when our skill set is being developed on the gifts and indwelling of the Holy Spirit within us. Now remember, with the Holy Spirit in you, it is him who gives you strength, it is him who gives you hope, and it is him who takes your skill level to a courageous level. And when we are walking according to the Spirit of God, he takes our little bit of courage and he makes it tenfold. There's no ceiling to courage when we are walking fully according to the Holy Spirit. Now I want to address the issue of how to choose courage in the midst of adversity. And I think Jesus says we must take courage. So that gives me this visualization that it's something that you kind of have to reach out and grab. And you have to kind of do it in a tangible way. When Jesus says take courage, he's like, it's not just a simple command, right? Like, oh, go over there and take courage. But what he's saying is, he's trying to say, like a loving father, like a father says to his son, with a sensitive belief in his son, a confidence in his son, an understanding of the situation, understanding his son's skill set, and then pushing his son towards the best outcome. I think that's what the flavor I get when Jesus says, take courage. Don't doubt, take courage. And so I think number one is that we just have to listen to the loving instruction of Jesus in the midst of any adversity, and we just have to reach out and take hold of courage. And sometimes that's just a simple act of reaching out and taking hold of Jesus. It's that picture that I have that comes into movies where there are two men that are, they're in a battle and they're fighting something, and one of the men falls and his buddy walks over and he puts his hand out, and then the other guy grabs his hand, and then he lifts him up out of off the cliff or out of the pit or helps him stand back up again. It's that kind of idea that Jesus is saying, take courage. And sometimes what that means is Jesus is reaching down and I'm reaching out, and he's going to grab a hold of my arm and he's going to yank me up into courage. The other thing I think that is important to understand in that is, I like Jocko Willink in his book, Extreme Ownership. He says, when it comes to courage, you have to aggressively step into it. You can't kind of be timid about it. You just got to aggressively step into it. And the other thing I think you can do in order to choose courage is you can have an accurate assessment of the danger of the situation. Don't diminish it, right? The Bible says very clearly, there is no temptation that has overcome you except that which is common to mankind. So we need to exercise courage on a daily basis because we are all tempted with very common things. And these common temptations can be a temptation to do something we shouldn't do, but it also can be a temptation to fall into recklessness. It can be a temptation to fall into passivity or cowardice. And so I think we cannot diminish the perceived danger of adversity and what it can do to us. And so whenever we're in a pickle, whenever we're in a snare, whenever we're facing suffering, whenever things are going bad, I think it's very important to remind ourselves that we need to choose courage. The third thing or fourth thing that you could do to help you choose courage is this: spend your time focusing on the worthiness of the cause. I was talking to one of my coaches, and I was just describing to him, everything that's been going on in my life, and he was listening to me. And after about 45 minutes, he said, Doug, I think the issue is you need to focus on your why. You really need to clarify your why, because I feel like you're losing your why. And I go, hey, could you tease that out for me and help me? He goes, yeah. He goes, look, we all have to have a worthy cause. And it's a cause that we can't just make up or want to be worthy. It's got to be something that our soul really believes is worthy. And so you've got to find your why. Why would you continue to do what you're doing? And so I thought, boy, that's a great point. Have I really clarified my why? Well, Paul had certainly done that. He said, for to me to live is Christ, but to die is gain. The best way to choose courage in any situation is to focus on the highest cause of your life. It is to be more heavenly minded and less earthly minded. I was listening to Dr. Peter Kreeft, and he is now the professor emeritus of philosophy at Boston University. And I was listening to one of his lectures, and he was talking about people who have the greatest earthly impact. And he said something that really stuck with me. He said, what I find interesting is that the people who have the greatest impact here on earth tend to be the most heavenly minded people. He says they have their head and their heart in heaven, and that's what allows them to have such a huge impact here on earth. What a great perspective that is. And I'm starting to think that that's what courage is in the midst of adversity, is that the more heavenly minded you become, the more courageous you become. It reminds me of the story of the Apostle Peter when he finally ended up in Rome. And I believe it was during the Neronian emperorship, and he was put in Nero's circus, which was kind of like an amphitheater where they did a bunch of stuff. It wasn't the Colosseum. It's called the circus. And one of the things is that he was going to be executed. And when they took him out there, he said, I don't want to be crucified like my Lord and Savior. And the story is that they crucified him upside down until he died. I don't know how you do that and make that request unless you are absolutely heavenly minded, right? You have to be heavenly minded in order to do that. And that's where courage comes from. I've always felt that courage is so important to your life. And it's so important to overcome because it allows you not only to grow stronger, but it gives you perseverance. And so I think Jesus wants to give you courage. And today I just want you to walk away with this message, is that it comes to Jesus giving you courage. Does it come from within you, or is it something that Jesus gives to you from outside of you? In other words, does it require understanding in order for you to choose courage? Does it require empathy in order for you to become stronger? Does compassion create fortitude? I'm not going to answer these questions. I think you should think about these things yourself, because in the end, you need to know what you believe and why you believe it. And most importantly, I think you need to know how Jesus Christ is going to develop more courage within you. And when you discover that, your life will never be the same. I just want to say thanks for listening to Salty Pastor today. And if you could just do me a huge favor and go over to our YouTube channel, Salty Pastor, and if you would like and subscribe, because that helps get our views up. Secondly, if you want to go to our website and look at past episodes, we just finished a 12-part series on your identity, which I have thought has been an excellent series for people who are just starting out to listen to. Please do so. If you're there, also click on that donate button and help support this ministry so that it continue to expand. This is Salty Pastor, and I'm signing off, and I just want you to remember, always think for yourself.